Some people are forgotten by the world, cast aside like broken things nobody wants to fix. But sometimes the most unlikely person becomes the key to everything. A homeless woman with no family and no name finds herself captured during a Viking raid on a small village. Chained and terrified, she becomes a prize of war. But when Einar the Red-Fanged, a brutal warlord known throughout the north, crouches down beside her and whispers those shocking words, everything changes. He doesn't see her as just another slave. This savage warrior believes she carries something powerful within her, a destiny that could save his dying clan. As enemies close in and betrayal lurks around every corner, she must choose between trusting this dangerous man or trying to escape. But what if running away means abandoning the only purpose she's ever had? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like the breath of sleeping gods. And Astrid, though she had no name then, only the ache of emptiness where belonging should have been, picked through the ruins of what had once been Thornwick village. The acrid smell of burned thatch, and something far worse hung in the air, mixing with the salt tang from the nearby sea. Her bare feet, hardened by months of wandering, stepped carefully around the scattered belongings of people who would never need them again. She had arrived too late to witness the slaughter, but early enough to see the smoke still rising from collapsed roofs. This was how she lived now, always arriving after the important moments had passed, scavenging what remained of other people's lives. The irony wasn't lost on her that she had been searching for scraps of food when the Vikings had been searching for something far more valuable. The broken iron shackles around her wrists still bore the rust stains of whoever had worn them before her. She'd found them in an abandoned blacksmith's shop 3 villages back, and something about their weight had felt right, like they belonged to her story somehow. Now, as she heard the thunder of hooves approaching through the trees, she understood why fate had led her to put them on. Einar the Red-Fanged sat astride his massive black stallion like a man born to command both beast and battlefield. His presence seemed to drain warmth from the very air, and even his own men gave him a respectful distance. The scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw told stories of battles won through sheer brutality. But it was his eyes that truly marked him as dangerous, pale blue like winter ice, and far too knowing for a simple warrior. He had been dreaming of her for months now, though he would never admit such weakness to his warband. The dreams came in fragments, a woman with dark hair and defiant eyes, chains that turned to silver in moonlight, and always, always, the scent that spoke to something primal in his blood. His grandmother, the last of the old seers, had whispered of such things before the fever took her. She had spoken of bloodlines and prophecies, of a woman who would carry the future of their people in her very bones. "Another rat picking through the corpses," growled Bjorn, the axe-bearer, Einar's second in command. His voice carried the casual cruelty of a man who had stopped seeing individual lives as anything more than obstacles or opportunities. "Shall we move on? The sun climbs high, and we've wasted enough time on this burned village." But Einar's gaze had already found her, crouched beside the well like a wounded animal. Something in his chest tightened, not with lust, though that would have been easier to understand, but with recognition. The morning light caught the dark waves of her hair, and when she looked up at their approach, he saw eyes the color of storm clouds. Deep grey, touched with silver, and holding depths that spoke of suffering transformed into strength. She didn't run. That alone marked her as different from the usual survivors they encountered. Most scattered like leaves before wind when they heard the warband approach. But this woman, this nameless wanderer in chains that seemed to fit her like they'd been, forged for her alone, simply rose to her feet and faced them with the dignity of someone who had already lost everything and found freedom in that loss. "Take her," Einar commanded, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. But even as his men moved to obey, he found himself studying the way she held herself. Straight-backed despite the shackles, chin raised despite the circumstances. There was noble blood in her bearing, though her clothes were little more than rags. Astrid, still nameless to herself, felt the ground shift beneath her feet as rough hands seized her arms. She had been captured before by bandits and worse, but those had been simple transactions. Food, coin or flesh, straightforward hungers that could be satisfied or endured. This felt different. The way the scarred leader looked at her spoke of deeper currents, ancient needs that had nothing to do with the usual wants of men. The warband was a study in controlled violence. 23 warriors, each one bearing the marks of countless battles, yet all of them deferring to their jarl with the absolute respect that only comes from witnessing true leadership in action. These weren't raiders driven by simple greed. They moved with the purpose of men following a vision that reached beyond mere plunder. As they bound her to a spare horse, Astrid caught fragments of conversation that made little sense to her untrained ear. They spoke of bloodlines and signs, of powers that had slept too long in the earth. One of the younger warriors, barely past boyhood but already scarred, mentioned something about the old ways returning, and was quickly silenced by a sharp look from Bjorn. The countryside they travelled through bore the marks of their passage. Burned steadings, abandoned fields, and the occasional grave marker thrust hastily into rocky soil. But there was method to their destruction, patterns that suggested they were searching for something specific rather than simply spreading terror for its own sake. Einar rode at the front, but his attention kept drifting back to their captive. She sat her horse with surprising grace for someone who had been wandering afoot for months, and when their eyes met across the column, he felt that same electric recognition that had been haunting his dreams. His grandmother's words echoed in his memory. "When the time comes, you'll know her by scent and sight both. She'll carry the old blood, hidden but not lost. The old blood." Einar's own lineage traced back to the legendary seer warriors who had once advised kings and shaped the fate of entire kingdoms. That power had been diluted over generations, reduced to occasional prophetic dreams and an uncanny ability to read the truth in people's hearts. But the prophecies spoke of restoration, of a union that would reawaken abilities that had been sleeping for centuries. As the sun reached its zenith, they made camp in a grove of ancient oaks that seemed to whisper secrets in the wind. The trees were older than memory, their trunks scarred by runic markings left by travelers from ages past. Some of the symbols were familiar to Einar, protective wards and prayers to forgotten gods. Others spoke of deeper mysteries, of powers that mortal men were meant only to glimpse. While his men tended to their weapons and shared stories of raids past, Einar found himself drawn to where their captive sat in the shade of the largest oak. The chains around her wrists caught the dappled sunlight, and for a moment they seemed almost silver, almost ceremonial rather than merely practical. "What is your name?" he asked, settling onto his haunches before her with the fluid grace of a predator at rest. "I have none," she replied, and her voice carried the clear notes of educated speech despite her ragged appearance. "Names are for people who belong somewhere." It was then that he caught it, the scent that had been teasing at the edges of his awareness since they'd taken her. Not just the usual smells of someone who had been living rough, but something deeper, richer, something that spoke to instincts he hadn't fully understood until this moment. "I can smell your fertile," he said, the words emerging from some primal part of his mind before his civilized thoughts could stop them. The effect was immediate and electric. Her storm-grey eyes widened, but not with the fear he might have expected. Instead, something almost like recognition flickered in their depths, as if some part of her had been waiting for exactly those words. Around them, the ancient oak seemed to lean closer, and the wind carried the faint sound of something that might have been laughter or weeping, or the whisper of fate itself finally beginning to move after long years of patient waiting. The words hung in the air between them like a blade poised to fall. Astrid felt something shift deep within her chest. Not fear, though she should have been terrified, but a strange sense of puzzle pieces clicking into place. The carved bone pendant that had hung around her neck since childhood, hidden beneath. Her tattered clothing suddenly felt warm against her skin. Her grandmother had given her that pendant on her deathbed, whispering words in the old tongue that Astrid had never fully understood. "Guard it well, little star," the old woman had said, her fingers tracing the intricate knotwork carved into the bone. "When the time comes, it will call to its brother, and you will know your purpose." Now, as Einar's ice-blue eyes searched her, faced with an intensity that seemed to see straight through to her soul, that pendant burned like a live coal against her heart. "You speak strangely, Lord," she managed, though her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I am nothing but a wanderer, with no clan and no value." Einar's hand moved to his throat, where beneath his leather tunic lay a pendant identical to hers, though he had no way of knowing that yet. The gesture was unconscious, driven by the same inexplicable pull that had drawn him to utter those primitive words. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory. "The bloodline calls to bloodline, child. When you find her, the bone will sing." "Bjorn," Einar called without taking his eyes from Astrid. "Gather the men. We change our plans." The big warrior approached, with the heavy tread of someone accustomed to bearing bad news. "Jarl, the scouts report King Godfred's forces are only 2 days behind us. If we linger here, let them come," Einar said, rising to his full height. "We have found what we were truly seeking." A murmur ran through the warband, part excitement and part unease. They had followed Einar through countless battles, trusted his judgment in matters of war and strategy, but this felt different. This felt like stepping into the realm of mysteries that mortal men were not meant to touch. Astrid watched the exchange with growing alarm. Whatever game was being played here, she was clearly the central piece. And the stakes seemed far higher than her simple life should warrant. The pendant around her neck continued to pulse with that strange warmth, and she found herself thinking of stories her grandmother had told, tales of ancient bloodlines and powers that had once shaped the world. "You cannot keep me," she said, though even as the words left her lips, she wondered if she truly wanted to escape. For the first time in her adult life, someone was looking at her as if she mattered, as if she was more than just another mouth to feed or burden to bear. Einar turned back to her, and when he smiled, it was the expression of a wolf who had caught the scent of its destined prey. "I am not keeping you, woman with no name. I am claiming what was always meant to be mine." The temperature in the grove seemed to drop several degrees. Even the birds fell silent, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Astrid felt a chill. That had nothing to do with the weather. This was the cold of fate moving, of wheels set in motion that could not be stopped. "My lord," ventured young Ragnar, one of the newer members of the warband, "perhaps we should consult the bones before—" "The bones have already spoken," Einar cut him off sharply. "They spoke in dreams, and now they speak in flesh and blood." Astrid's hand moved unconsciously to her pendant, and the moment her fingers touched the carved bone, the world exploded into light and sound. Visions flashed through her mind, a great hall filled with warriors, herself standing beside a throne carved from a single massive tree, children with eyes like storm clouds playing in courtyards she had never seen. And through it all, the scent of pine and iron, the sound of steel on steel, and a voice that might have been her own speaking words of power in the old tongue. She gasped and stumbled, her legs suddenly unsteady. Einar was at her side in an instant, his strong hands catching her before she could fall. The moment his skin touched hers, she felt it, a recognition so deep it seemed to echo in her very bones. This was not the first time they had touched. Somehow, impossibly, they had found each other before. "The pendant," she whispered, her voice barely audible. You have one too. Einar's eyes widened, and without hesitation he drew his own pendant from beneath his tunic. The bone was carved in exactly the same pattern, the same intricate knotwork that seemed to shift and flow in the dappled sunlight. When he held it near hers, both began to glow with a soft, silver light. The warband fell to their knees as one, recognizing the fulfillment of prophecy when they saw it. Even Bjorn, skeptical by nature and hardened by years of warfare, lowered his head in something approaching reverence. "The seer's bones," breathed an old warrior named Eric, his voice thick with awe. The legends were true. Astrid stared at the glowing pendants, her mind reeling. "What does this mean?" Einar's voice, when he answered, carried the weight of destiny itself. "It means, my nameless one, that you are not without clan after all. You are the last daughter of the Moonweavers, and I am the last son of the Stormcallers. Our bloodlines were severed 3 generations ago by war and politics, but the old magic remembers what we have forgotten." The implications hit her like a physical blow. If what he said was true, then she was not the abandoned child she had always believed herself to be. She was the heir to a legacy of power, the last link in a chain that stretched back to the very foundations of their world. "But I know nothing of magic," she protested. "I can barely feed myself, let alone wield ancient powers." "The knowing will come," Einar said, and for the first time since she had met him, his voice was gentle rather than commanding. "The blood remembers, even when the mind forgets." A horn sounded in the distance. Long, low, and ominous. Bjorn leaped to his feet, his hand automatically going to his sword hilt. "King Godfred's scouts," he reported grimly. "They've found our trail." Einar's expression hardened back into the mask of the warrior chief. "How long?" "Perhaps an hour, if we're fortunate. 2 at most." Astrid felt the ground shift beneath her feet again. But this time it was not magic. It was the simple, terrible reality of being caught between forces far greater than herself. "Why does the king pursue you?" "Because," Einar said, his voice carrying bitter irony, "King Godfred fears the return of the old ways. He has built his power on the ashes of the ancient bloodlines, and he knows that if the seer warriors return, his reign ends." The carved bone pendant against her chest pulsed with warmth, and Astrid felt something stirring in the depths of her mind. Not quite memory, but an awareness of potential that had been sleeping until this moment. She was no longer just a homeless wanderer. She was the key to a war that had been brewing for decades, the catalyst that could reshape the future of every kingdom in the north. And somewhere in the distance, the sound of approaching horses carried the promise that their enemies were already closing in. The warband moved with the fluid efficiency of wolves retreating before a larger pack. Within minutes, their temporary camp had been erased, leaving only scattered ash and trampled grass to mark their passage. Astrid found herself mounted on a sturdy mare, her shackles removed but replaced with leather bonds that were somehow more unsettling. They suggested trust, or at least the expectation of cooperation. The silver mirror that hung from Einar's saddle caught her attention as they rode hard through the dense forest. It was no ordinary-looking glass, but a sheet of polished metal inscribed with symbols that seemed to shift and dance when viewed from the corner of her eye. When she had asked about it, old Eric had whispered that it was a scrying glass, used by the ancient seers to glimpse possible futures. "It shows only fragments," he had explained, his weathered face creased with worry. "Shadows of what might be if the threads of fate align properly. But the Jarl has been staring into it for months, searching for signs of your coming." Now, as they pushed their horses through increasingly treacherous terrain, Astrid caught glimpses of that mirror flashing in the sunlight, and each time she felt a strange pull in her chest, as if something within her was trying to reach out and touch whatever mysteries lay hidden in its surface. The pursuit behind them was relentless. King Godfred's forces had clearly been tracking Einar's movements for some time, and they pressed forward with the determination of men who knew exactly what they were hunting. The periodic blast of war horns echoed through the valleys, each, one closer than the last. There, Bjorn pointed to a narrow pass between two towering cliff faces. The Serpent's Gate. If we can reach it before they close the distance, we might yet escape. Einar's jaw tightened as he studied the approaching passage. And if they catch us in the pass, then we make our stand with stone walls on either side. And nowhere to retreat, Bjorn replied grimly. Astrid listened to this exchange with growing dread. She had spent years avoiding conflict, slipping away from trouble before it could find her. The idea of being trapped in a narrow canyon with enemies closing from behind felt like a nightmare made manifest. Why not simply release me? She asked, though part of her already dreaded the answer. If I am what draws their pursuit, let me go, and you can escape safely. Einar reined in his mount so sharply that several of the other riders had to swerve to avoid collision. When he turned to look at her, his pale eyes burned with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. You understand nothing? He said, his voice low and dangerous. You are not a burden to be cast off. You are the future of our people, the key to powers that have been sleeping for 3 generations. I would die before I let Godfred's butchers lay hands on you. The vehemence in his voice surprised her, but more surprising was the way her heart leaped at his words. She had spent so long being unwanted, being the person everyone was eager to be rid of, that the idea of being precious to someone felt almost foreign. But I don't know how to be what you need me to be, she said, and her voice came out smaller than she intended. I can't even remember my own name, let alone wield ancient magic. Names are power, said a new voice, and Astrid turned to see that old Eric had urged his horse closer. In the old days, a seer's true name was never spoken aloud until the moment of their awakening. Perhaps your forgetting was not loss, but preparation. Before Astrid could ask what he meant, a shout from the rear guard cut through their conversation. Riders, at least 50, coming fast. The war band spurred their horses forward with renewed urgency, but Astrid could see that the pass was still dangerously far ahead. Their mounts were already lathered with sweat, and the pursuing forces had the advantage of fresh horses and superior numbers. As they crested a small ridge, Astrid caught her first clear glimpse of their pursuers. King Godfred's warriors rode, beneath banners of black and gold, their armor gleaming in the afternoon sun. At their head rode a figure in a golden helm, the king himself, she realized with a chill. This was no routine pursuit. This was a royal hunt. He leads them personally. Bjorn observed, his voice tight with worry. He must fear us more than we knew, or desire what we carry more than we understood, Einar replied, his gaze flicking to Astrid with protective intensity. The Serpent's Gate loomed ahead, a narrow cleft in the rock that looked barely wide enough for 2 riders to pass abreast. Ancient carvings covered the stone walls on either side, worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain, but still visible enough to recognize as protective wards. The old magic still holds here, Eric breathed, his eyes wide with wonder. See how the symbols glow. Astrid looked more carefully and gasped. The carvings were indeed glowing with a faint silver light, the same color as their pendants had shown when brought together. As they approached the entrance to the pass, she felt the pendant around her neck growing warm again. What does it mean? She asked. It means, Einar said, his voice filled with sudden hope, that this place remembers the old bloodlines. The wards were set by our ancestors, and they still recognize their own. Behind them, the war horns of their pursuers grew closer, the sound echoing off the surrounding cliffs with increasing urgency. But as the first of Einar's riders entered the pass, something extraordinary happened. The ancient symbols flared brighter, and the very air within the narrow canyon began to shimmer like heat haze. By the gods, whispered young Ragnar, his voice filled with awe. The stones are awakening. Astrid felt it too, a thrumming in the earth beneath her horse's hooves, a resonance that seemed to answer the call of the pendant around her neck. Power was stirring here, ancient and vast, and somehow she was the key that had unlocked it. But as the last of their company entered the protection of the pass, she looked back to see King Godfred's forces spreading out along the ridge behind them. The king himself sat his horse like a statue, his golden helm glinting in the sunlight as he studied the glowing entrance to the Serpent's Gate. Even at this distance, Astrid could feel his gaze like a weight upon her soul. This was not over. Whatever sanctuary the ancient wards might provide, it would not hold forever, and when they emerged from this place, the real battle would begin. The Serpent's Gate closed behind them with a sound like thunder rolling through the mountains, where, moments before, there had been an open passage. Now only solid stone remained, seamlessly joined as if the entrance had never existed. The ancient wards had responded to their presence, sealing them safely within, but also trapping them in a canyon with no visible exit. "The runic staff," Eric said reverently, pointing to a carved wooden pole that had materialized beside the sealed entrance. The staff stood taller than a man, its surface covered in spiraling runes that pulsed with the same silver light as the canyon walls. "It appears only when the bloodline calls. Legend says it holds the power to open paths through stone and time itself." Astrid stared at the staff, feeling an inexplicable pull toward it. The pendant around her neck had grown so warm it was almost burning, and her hands trembled with the urge to reach out and grasp the ancient artifact. But something held her back, perhaps the knowledge that touching it would change her forever. The canyon itself was a marvel that spoke of powers beyond mortal understanding. The walls rose hundreds of feet on either side, their surfaces covered in layer upon layer of carved symbols. Some she almost recognized, protective wards and blessing signs that her grandmother had scratched into doorframes and thresholds. Others were completely alien, speaking of magics that predated human memory. "How long can the wards hold?" Bjorn asked, his practical mind already working on their tactical situation. "As long as needed," Einar replied, though his voice carried undertones of uncertainty. "The ancient magic doesn't follow the same rules as sword and shield, but Godfred will not simply wait outside forever. He has resources we can barely imagine." Mance, if summoned by his words, a new sound reached them from beyond the sealed entrance, chanting in the old tongue, but twisted somehow, the syllables sharp and cutting where they should have been flowing. The very air in the canyon began to vibrate with conflicting energies. "He has brought sorcerers," Eric said, his weathered face pale with fear. "Men who have learned to corrupt the old ways, to turn the ancient powers against themselves." Astrid felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Can they break through?" "Given time, perhaps," Einar admitted. "The corrupted magic is like acid. It eats away at everything it touches, even itself, but it can be devastatingly effective in the short term." Young Ragnar approached the runic staff with the reverence of a worshipper entering a sacred shrine. "My lord, if the legends are true, could this not open a path to safety?" "Only one of the bloodline can wield it," Eric said, his gaze moving meaningfully to Astrid, "and the price of its use is said to be terrible." All eyes turned to her, and Astrid felt the weight of expectation like a physical force. These hardened warriors, men who had faced death countless times without flinching, were looking to her, a homeless wanderer who couldn't even remember her own name, to save them all. "What kind of price?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. Eric's ancient eyes were sad as he replied, "The staff draws its power from the life force of the one who wields it. Each use shortens the wielder's span of years. Great magic always demands great sacrifice." The chanting outside grew louder, more insistent, and the silver glow of the protective wards began to flicker like a candle in a strong wind. Whatever Godfred's sorcerers were doing, it was working. "How much time would we lose?" Astrid pressed, moving closer to the staff despite her fear. "Impossible to say," Eric admitted. "Some of the legends speak of decades taken in a single use. Others suggest the cost varies depending on the wielder's strength and the magnitude of what they attempt. Einar stepped between her and the staff, his expression fierce with protective instinct. "There has to be another way. I will not ask you to sacrifice years of your life for men you barely know." "But these aren't just any men," Astrid said, surprised by the certainty in her own voice. "They're your men, and if the prophecies are true, then their fate and mine are already intertwined." The truth of it settled over her like a warm cloak. For the first time in her adult life, she belonged somewhere. These rough warriors had accepted her not as a burden, but as one of their own. More than that, they had shown her a purpose she had never dared dream of. "Besides," she added with a wry smile, "what use are extra years if I spend them alone and forgotten?" Before anyone could stop her, she reached out and grasped the runic staff. The moment her fingers touched the carved wood, the world exploded into sensation. Power flowed through her like molten silver, burning and exhilarating at once. She could feel the mountain around them, sense every grain of stone and whisper of wind. And beyond that, she could perceive the threads of possibility that stretched out into the future. Paths that led to victory and defeat, to love and loss, to glory and destruction. The staff was not just a tool, it was a repository of memory, containing the accumulated wisdom of every seer who had wielded it before her. Their voices whispered in her mind, sharing secrets that had been lost for generations. She saw how to shape stone like clay, how to step between moments and emerge in distant places, how to read the true names written in the hearts of all living things. And she learned her own name at last. Not the common word her grandmother had, or called her, but the true name that had been hidden even from herself until this moment of awakening. She was Astrid Moonweaver, last daughter of a line that stretched back to the dawn of the world, and the power that flowed through her veins was older than kingdoms. But with the knowledge came the price. She could feel something essential being drawn out of her. Not just years, but the very essence of mortality that made life precious. The bargain was struck before she fully understood its terms, sealed by her willing touch upon the ancient wood. "Now I remember," she whispered, and her voice carried harmonics that made the canyon walls ring like bells. "I remember everything." The chanting outside reached a crescendo, and cracks began to appear in the sealed entrance. But Astrid simply smiled and raised the runic staff, feeling the mountain respond to her will. She knew exactly where they needed to go and how to get there. The only question was whether any of them would live to see what lay at the end of their journey. The world folded around them like a page being turned in an ancient book. One moment, they stood in the Serpent's Gate with King Godfred's corrupted magic eating at the protective wards, and the next, they emerged into a hidden valley that existed between the mountains and the sky. The transition left most of the warband retching and disoriented, but Astrid, now fully awakened to her heritage, stood steady as stone. The crystal dagger at her belt hummed with resonant power, a weapon that had appeared in her hand the moment she had fully grasped the runic staff. It was no ordinary blade, but a shard of pure starlight given form, capable of cutting through the barriers between worlds. The knowledge of its use flowed through her like inherited memory, though she could feel the years the magic had stolen settling like frost in her bones. "Where are we?" Bjorn asked, his warrior's instincts already cataloguing the tactical advantages and disadvantages of their new position. The valley was perhaps a mile across, ringed by peaks so high their summits disappeared into cloud. At its center stood the ruins of what had once been a magnificent hall, its broken walls still bearing traces of gold and silver inlaying. "The hearthland of the Moonweavers," Astrid replied, her voice carrying an authority that surprised even her. "My people's ancient stronghold, hidden from the world for 3 generations. The runic staff brought us home." Eric dropped to one knee, his weathered face filled with wonder. The lost citadel. The songs spoke truly. It was not destroyed, merely hidden beyond the reach of mortal eyes. But as Astrid walked toward the ruined hall, she could see the truth that the legends had not recorded. Her people had not simply hidden their stronghold, they had abandoned it, fleeing some catastrophe that had left scorch marks on stones that should have been immune to fire. The crystal formations that once powered their greatest workings lay shattered, their light dimmed to barely perceptible glimmers. What happened here? Einar asked, joining her at the threshold of the great hall. Inside, the remains of a vast library lay scattered, scrolls and carved tablets that contained the accumulated wisdom of the seer bloodlines, most now reduced to ash and fragments. War, Astrid said simply, though the word carried the weight of bitter understanding. Not the simple clash of sword and shield, but something far more destructive. Someone or something turned our own power against us. The memories flowing through the runic staff were fragmented here, as if the very act of remembering was painful for the ancient artifact. She caught glimpses of figures in dark robes wielding corrupted versions of the old magic, of protective wards failing one by one, of her ancestors making desperate choices in the face of inevitable defeat. Godfred's sorcerers, Einar said, his voice grim with understanding, or their predecessors. The corruption of the ancient ways didn't begin with him. He merely inherited techniques that others had developed. Young Ragnar emerged from exploring the outer buildings, his face pale with shock. "My lord, you need to see this." He led them to what had once been a nursery, its walls painted with cheerful images of sun and moon and dancing stars. But the paintings had been defaced, the innocent imagery twisted into something dark and threatening. Worse, the small bones scattered across the floor told a story that made even hardened warriors look away. "They killed the children first," Astrid said, her voice hollow with grief for people she had never known, but whose blood flowed in her veins. They wanted to make sure the bloodlines could never recover. The crystal dagger at her belt pulsed, with cold fire responding to her emotional state. For a moment, she understood the temptation that had led her ancestors down the path of revenge. It would be so easy to let the ancient power flow through her, to seek out those responsible, and make them pay for this atrocity. But Einar's hand on her shoulder brought her back to herself. "That path leads only to darkness," he said quietly. "I have walked it myself, and I know where it ends." She looked at him with new understanding, seeing past the surface brutality to the pain beneath. "Is that why you earned the name Red-Fanged?" His smile was bitter as winter wind. "I was not always as I am now. Once I too was driven by the need for vengeance. The name comes from a night when I lost myself completely to the old rage, when I became something that was more beast than man. The blood I spilled that night was innocent, and no amount of justification can wash it clean." The admission hung between them like a bridge across an abyss. Astrid felt something shift in her perception of him, not lessening of respect, but a deeper understanding of the man behind the fearsome reputation. He was not just a weapon to be pointed at their enemies, but someone who had walked through darkness and found his way back to the light. "The corruption spreads," Eric observed, examining the twisted paintings more closely. "See how the very pigments have changed. This is not just defacement. The dark magic has infected the materials themselves." As if summoned by his words, a sound reached them from the valley's entrance, the unmistakable ring of steel on stone. Their pursuers had found them, despite the mystical barriers that should have kept the valley hidden. "Impossible," Bjorn breathed. "The old wards are failing," Astrid finished grimly. "The corruption in this place is like a beacon, calling to its own kind. By bringing us here, I may have led us into a trap of my ancestors' making." Through the broken walls of the hall, they could see figures moving at the valley's edge. Not just Godfred's warriors, but robed sorcerers whose very presence seemed to drain color from the world around them. The corrupted magic they wielded was like a poison in the air, making the ancient stones weep tears of black liquid. But worse than the immediate threat was what Astrid could sense through her connection to the runic staff. The sorcerers were not just attacking, They were performing some kind of ritual, drawing power from the scattered crystal fragments and channeling it toward a purpose that made her blood run cold. "They're not trying to capture us," she realized, her voice tight with growing horror. "They're trying to complete what was started here 3 generations ago. They want to drain the valley itself, to corrupt the very heart of the old magic and use it to fuel their dark workings. If they succeeded, it would not just mean the end of the ancient bloodlines, it would poison the mystical currents that flowed beneath the earth, spreading corruption across the entire known world until nothing remained but darkness and despair." The golden torque around Einar's neck began to burn against his skin as the corrupted sorcerers pressed closer to the valley's heart. The ancient artifact had been passed down through his bloodline for generations, a symbol of leadership that carried within it the accumulated wisdom of the Stormcaller kings. Now it blazed with warning light, responding to the presence of magic that should not exist. "The ritual circle," Astrid said, pointing toward the center of the ruined hall, where a pattern of interlocking circles had been carved into the stone floor. "That's what they're trying to reach. If they complete their working there, using the corrupted crystals as a focus, the entire valley becomes a weapon," Einar finished, his understanding of ancient warfare filling in the implications. They could channel its power to strike at any target across the known world. The warband had taken defensive positions among the rubble, but they all knew that conventional tactics would be useless against enemies who could bend reality to their will. Their only advantage lay in the fact that the sorcerers needed to reach the ritual circle to complete their working, and the path to it led directly through the heart of the ruined hall. 23 warriors against 50 soldiers, and a dozen sorcerers, Bjorn observed with grim humor. "I've faced worse odds. Not against enemies like these," Eric warned. "The corrupted magic doesn't just kill, it consumes. Every man they strike down feeds their power, makes them stronger." Astrid felt the weight of decision settling on her shoulders. The runic staff could turn the tide of battle, but each use would cost her precious years of life. The crystal dagger could cut through their magical defenses, but wielding it required her to channel power through her own body, power that burned like acid in mortal veins. "There might be another way," she said slowly, studying the pattern of the ritual circle with new understanding. "The corruption has infected this place, but it hasn't destroyed it completely. If I could reverse the polarity of the working, you would have to enter the circle yourself," Einar said, immediately grasping the danger. "Place yourself at the very center of their ritual. It's the only way to turn their own power against them. But I would need time and protection while I work." Young Ragnar stepped forward, his youthful face set with determination. "Then you shall have it. We didn't follow our Jarl through half the Northlands to fail him now." One by one, the other warriors nodded their agreement. These were men who had chosen loyalty over safety long ago, and the thought of abandoning their leaders now never entered their minds. The first wave of attackers reached the outer walls as the sun touched the western peaks. Godfred's soldiers moved with professional precision, their shields locked and spears leveled, while the sorcerers hung back and began their chanting. The very air around the robed figures shimmered with malevolent energy, and where their feet touched the ancient stones, cracks spread outward like spiderwebs. "Now we see what we're truly made of," Einar said, drawing his sword. The blade sang as it cleared the scabbard, its steel catching the dying light like captured flame. The golden torque at his throat pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat, lending strength to his arm and clarity to his mind. The battle that followed was unlike anything in mortal memory. Steel clashed against steel, while energies older than kingdoms flowed and twisted overhead. Bjorn's great axe hewn through shields and mail as if they were made of parchment, while Eric called upon half-remembered battle prayers that made the very stones beneath their feet ring like hammered bronze. But for every soldier that fell, 2 more pressed forward, and the sorcerer's chanting grew stronger with each passing moment. Black tendrils of corrupted magic lashed out like living things, and where they touched, armor corroded and flesh withered. "I have to reach the circle," Astrid called over the din of battle, but Einar shook his head. "Not yet. The sorcerers are still too strong. They would overwhelm you before you could begin." Even as he spoke, one of the robed figures raised his hands and spoke a word in the old tongue that had been twisted beyond recognition. The stones of the hall floor buckled and split, opening a fissure that breathed forth smoke and sulphur. From within came the sound of something vast and hungry, stirring to wakefulness. "They're summoning a demon," Eric breathed, his weathered face pale with terror. "A creature of pure corruption that feeds on magical energy." The thing that emerged from the fissure defied easy description. It was shadow given substance, hunger given form, with eyes like dying stars and claws that could tear reality itself. Where it moved, the ancient stones cracked and bled, and the very air around it turned poisonous. Young Ragnar charged the creature with desperate courage, his sword blazing with the blessing Eric had placed upon it. But the demon's claw swept through his guard, as if it weren't there, and the young warrior crumpled to the ground, his life force visibly draining away to feed the monster's endless appetite. "Enough," Astrid said, and her voice carried harmonics that made the mountains themselves tremble. The crystal dagger flashed in her hand as she stepped into the open, and the golden torque around Einar's neck blazed in response to her power. The demon turned toward her, with something that might have been anticipation, sensing a source of energy far richer than any it had yet encountered. But as it lunged forward with supernatural speed, Astrid simply smiled and raised the runic staff. The staff's power flowed through her like molten silver, and she felt years of her life burning away like candles in a hurricane. But with that sacrifice came understanding. She could see the threads that bound the demon to this realm, the corrupted words that gave it form and purpose. The crystal dagger sang as it cut through reality itself, severing the bindings with surgical precision. The demon's roar of frustration shook dust from the broken walls as it was dragged back into whatever hell had spawned it. But its banishment came at a terrible cost. Astrid staggered as the backlash of severed magic coursed through her body, and she could feel the cold touch of accelerated time settling deeper into her bones. "The circle," she gasped, pointing toward the ritual pattern with a hand that now showed the first traces of premature aging. "While they're disrupted, now or never." And as Einar's warriors closed ranks around her in a protective wedge, she ran toward the center of the ancient working, carrying with her the hopes of all who still believed that light could triumph over darkness. Astrid reached the center of the ritual circle, just as King Godfred himself strode through the breach in the outer wall. But the man who entered was not the king she had glimpsed from a distance. This figure moved with an otherworldly grace that spoke of powers far beyond mortal ken. When he raised his head, his eyes burned with the same silver light that had once marked the greatest of the ancient seers. The obsidian crown upon his brow was no mere symbol of earthly authority. Carved from a single piece of volcanic glass and inlaid with runes that hurt to look upon directly, it was an artifact of the old magic, but one that had been corrupted beyond recognition. Where it touched his flesh, veins of black spread outward, like infected wounds, and when he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that made reality itself shiver. "Sister," he said, and the word fell into the sudden silence like a stone into still water. "At last we meet as we were meant to, not as enemies, but as the last inheritors of our people's true legacy." Astrid felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The runic staff in her hands grew cold as ice, and through its ancient memories she glimpsed a truth that had been hidden from her until this moment. Godfred was not just any king who had learned to wield corrupted magic, he was her brother, the twin from whom she had been separated at birth during the chaos of their people's fall. "Impossible," she breathed, But even as the word left her lips, she could see the resemblance that had been hidden by years and power, and the changes wrought by dark magic. The same storm-grey eyes, the same determined jawline, the same noble bearing that no amount of corruption could entirely erase. "Our grandmother saved us both," Godfred continued, his voice carrying a terrible gentleness. "But she could only hide one of us in safety. The other, the stronger, the more gifted, had to remain behind to face the trials that would forge him into a weapon capable of completing what our ancestors began. Behind him, his sorcerers lowered their hands, their chanting dying to whispers. This was no longer a battle to be won through force. This was a family reunion that had been decades in the making. "You were given the easier path," Godfred said, gesturing toward the ruined hall around them. "Allowed to forget, to live in ignorance while I bore the weight of memory and purpose. Do you know what it cost me to master the corrupted arts? What I had to sacrifice to become strong enough to reclaim our birthright?" Astrid could see it in the lines of his face, in the way the obsidian crown had fused with his flesh. Every use of the dark magic had taken something from him, not just years of life, but pieces of his humanity. He had made himself into a living weapon, trading his soul for the power to avenge their people. "The corruption," she began, but he cut her off with a gesture, "is merely a tool like any other. Yes, it exacts a price, but what worthwhile thing does not? Our ancestors were too pure, too concerned with maintaining their moral superiority to embrace the weapons they needed to survive. I learned from their mistakes." Einar stepped forward, the golden torque around his neck blazing with warning light. "Whatever blood you share, he is not the same person he once was. The corruption has consumed him from within." But Godfred only smiled, and in that expression Astrid could see traces of the brother she might have known. "Ah, the last storm caller speaks. Tell me, cousin, for that is what we are, distantly, how many innocents have you killed in service to what you call justice? How many villages have burned because you needed resources or information?" The accusation hit home, and Astrid could see the guilt that flickered across Einar's features. The brutal reputation that had earned him the name Red-Fanged was not entirely undeserved, and they all knew it. "The difference," Einar said quietly, "is that I learned to be better. You embraced the darkness and called it strength. I embraced reality," Godfred corrected. "The world is not a place for the pure of heart. It belongs to those strong enough to seize it and wise enough to hold it." He turned his attention back to Astrid, and she felt the full weight of his presence pressing against her mind. Through the obsidian crown, she could sense the vast network of power he had built. Corrupted seer stones placed in strategic locations across the continent, all of them drawing energy from the innocent and feeding it back to him. "Join me, sister," he said, extending his hand toward her. "Together we can restore our people to their rightful place as the rulers of this world. No more hiding in forgotten valleys or living as outcasts. We will remake the world in our image, and none will dare stand against us." The offer was tempting in ways she hadn't expected. Through her connection to the runic staff, she could see how it might work. The two of them, wielding both pure and corrupted versions of the ancient magic, could indeed reshape reality itself. They could bring back their dead ancestors, rebuild the lost citadels, reclaim everything that had been taken from them. But she could also see the cost. Every soul in the known world would become a resource to be consumed, every life a candle to be burned in service to their grand design. The corruption would spread until nothing remained but power for its own sake, emptied of all meaning or purpose. "I remember our grandmother's last words," Astrid said softly. "She told me to guard something well, to wait until the time came to know my purpose." Godfred's eyes narrowed. "She gave you the pendant. I wondered where it had gone." "Not just the pendant," Astrid replied, and for the first time since entering the circle she smiled. "She gave me a choice, the power to restore or the power to destroy, and the wisdom to know the difference. The crystal dagger in her hand began to sing with harmonic frequencies that made the corrupted seer stones in Godfred's network resonate in response. But instead of drawing power from them, she began to redirect their energy back upon itself, creating a feedback loop that would shatter his carefully constructed web of influence. "Sister," Godfred said, his voice carrying the first note of genuine alarm, "you don't understand what you're doing. Without the network to maintain the balance, the corruption will spread unchecked." "No," Astrid said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had finally understood her true purpose. "Without the network, the corruption will finally begin to heal." The obsidian crown upon his brow cracked as the feedback reached critical levels, and for just a moment, she saw her brother as he truly was. Not a monster drunk on power, but a frightened child who had been forced to carry burdens too heavy for any mortal soul. But the moment of recognition came too late. The crown shattered, releasing 3 generations' worth of stored corruption in a wave of destructive energy that threatened to tear the valley apart at its very foundations. The wave of released corruption struck the valley like a tsunami of pure malevolence. Ancient stones cracked and bled, the very air turned poisonous, and reality itself seemed to buckle under the weight of 3 generations' worth of concentrated evil. But Astrid stood at the center of it all, the runic staff blazing in her hands as she fought to contain forces that could unmake the world. The iron circlet that had appeared around her brow marked her not as a ruler, but as a guardian, the last seal between the corrupted magic and the innocent world beyond. Forged by her ancestors as a failsafe against exactly this scenario, it drew its power not from external sources, but from the wielder's own life force, burning away years of existence. To maintain the barriers that held chaos at bay. "The containment won't hold forever," Eric shouted over the howling winds that had sprung up as reality warped around them. "The iron circlet can only channel so much power before—" His words were cut off as a section of the valley wall simply ceased to exist, revealing the roiling void that lay beneath the material world. Through that gap, things that had never been born and should never be glimpsed pressed against the boundaries of existence, drawn by the scent of corruption like carrion birds to a battlefield. Godfred lay crumpled at the edge of the ritual circle, the destruction of his crown having aged him decades in as many seconds. But he was still alive, still conscious, and the look in his storm-grey eyes was one of terrible understanding. "You have to kill me," he said, his voice barely audible above the chaos surrounding them. "The corruption is still anchored to my life force. As long as I live, it will keep trying to break free." Astrid felt tears she hadn't known she was shedding freeze upon her cheeks. To have found her brother only to lose him again seemed like the cruelest jest fate could devise. But through the iron circlet's connection to the ancient magics, she could see that he was right. Threads of darkness still connected him to the spreading corruption, feeding it with every beat of his heart. "There has to be another way," she said, pouring more of her own life into the barriers, even as she felt years slipping away like sand through her fingers. "Some working of the old magic that could purify rather than destroy." "Look around you, sister," Godfred interrupted, his voice filled with bitter resignation. "This is what my choices have wrought. Every soul I consumed, every innocent life I sacrificed for power, they're all here now, demanding payment for what I've taken from them." Through the gaps in reality, Astrid could indeed see them, the ghostly forms of those who had died to fuel her brother's ambitions. They moved like a tide of sorrow, their faces bearing not hatred, but an unbearable sadness that made her want to weep for all the world's lost children. Einar reached her side, his own face marked by the strain of maintaining his defenses against the otherworldly winds. The golden torque around his neck had cracked under the pressure, its ancient protections barely sufficient to keep him anchored to the material realm. "How long can you hold it?" he asked, though they both knew the answer. Already, streaks of premature grey had appeared in her dark hair, and lines of exhaustion marked her features. The iron circlet was burning through her life force at an unsustainable rate. "Long enough," she replied, though she wasn't sure if that was true. "Get your men to safety. Get them as far from here as possible." "We're not leaving you," Bjorn declared, his great axe still ready despite the fact that no earthly weapon could touch the forces they now faced. "Whatever happens, we face it together." Young Ragnar, wounded but still standing, nodded his agreement. "We swore an oath to follow our Jarl wherever he led. That oath extends to those he chooses to protect." The loyalty in their voices might have warmed her heart under other circumstances, but now it only added to her burden. These good men would die for her, and their deaths would accomplish nothing except to feed more power to the corruption that was already too strong to contain much longer. "The old songs speak of a final working," Eric said suddenly, his ancient memory reaching back to half-forgotten lore. "The sundering, a way to separate the corruption from its anchor permanently." "But the cost, tell me," Astrid commanded, though she suspected she already knew what he would say. "The one who performs the sundering takes all the corruption into themselves, becoming a living prison for the darkness. But in doing so they are cut off from the world of the living forever, existing but not truly alive, conscious but unable to act or speak or touch anything they love. A fate worse than death, in other words, to become an eternal guardian standing watch over powers that could destroy the world, but to do so in complete isolation, with no hope of peace or rest or reunion with those she cared about." Godfred had dragged himself closer during their conversation, his face a mask of pain and regret. "Don't do it, sister. Don't sacrifice yourself for my mistakes. Let the corruption spread. Perhaps the world deserves what I've made of it." "No," Astrid said firmly, and for the first time since learning his identity, her voice carried no trace of uncertainty. "The world doesn't deserve to pay for either of our choices, and you," she looked down at him with eyes full of grief and love, "you deserve the chance to find peace at last." She could feel the barriers weakening, the iron circlet's power beginning to fluctuate as her life force burned lower. Soon, very soon, she would have to make the choice that would determine not just her own fate, but the fate of every living thing in the known world. But before she could begin the final working, a new voice cut through the chaos, clear and strong, and filled with an authority that made even the corrupted magic pause in its relentless advance. "There is another way." The speaker stood at the edge of the ritual circle, and Astrid's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the figure. It was her grandmother, not as she had appeared in life, aged and frail, but as she must have been in her youth, when the full power of the Moonweaver bloodline had flowed through her veins. "Grandmother?" Astrid whispered, though she knew this could not be real. The old woman had been dead for years, her body long since returned to the earth. "I am the memory of her," the figure replied, its voice carrying harmonics that belonged to the world beyond the veil, the echo of love and wisdom that she left embedded in the very stones of this place. "And I have been waiting for this moment since the day I first held you in my arms." The ghostly grandmother moved closer, and where her feet touched the corrupted ground, flowers of silver light bloomed and spread. "The sundering need not be performed alone, child. When two of the bloodline work in harmony, the burden can be shared, one to anchor the corruption, and one to transform it into something that can finally heal." Hope blazed in Astrid's heart, but it was quickly tempered by understanding. Godfred is too weak. The crown's destruction has left him barely alive. "Not Godfred," the memory grandmother said gently. "Me. I will anchor the corruption while you transform it. My death freed me from the limitations of flesh. I can contain forces that would destroy any living vessel." It was a solution that offered salvation for the world and redemption for her brother, but it would still require Astrid to sacrifice everything she had only just discovered. To work the transformation, She would have to pour her entire life force through the runic staff, leaving nothing behind but the memory of what might have been. As the barriers began their final collapse and the weight of decision settled upon her shoulders, Astrid looked one last time at Einar's face, memorizing every line and scar that told the story of the man she had come to love. Tomorrow, if she succeeded, he would remember her only as a stranger who had briefly touched his life before vanishing into legend. But perhaps, she thought as she raised the runic staff for the final working, that was enough. Perhaps love was. Not measured in time shared, but in the willingness to sacrifice everything for another's chance at happiness. The moment of choice arrived like thunder rolling across the mountains. Astrid felt the ancient power flowing through her as she joined her essence with that of her grandmother's memory, their combined will reaching out to grasp the writhing mass of corruption that threatened to consume everything they held dear. The silver chalice that materialized in her free hand was not a physical object, but a vessel of pure intention, capable of holding forces that existed beyond the boundaries of the material world. As she raised it toward the spreading darkness, the chalice began to sing with harmonics that resonated in the very foundations of reality. "Now, grandmother," Astrid whispered, and felt the ghostly presence merge with her own consciousness. Together, they spoke the words of the great transformation, syllables in the old tongue that had been lost for centuries. Their meaning preserved only in the deepest memories of the earth itself. The corruption fought them every step of the way, twisting and coiling like a living thing as they drew it into the silver chalice. Each thread of darkness that they captured screamed with the voices of all the innocence it had consumed, a chorus of pain that would have driven any mortal mind to madness. But Astrid was no longer merely mortal. The iron circlet had transformed her into something between human and force of nature, a living embodiment of the will to protect that which could not protect itself. Through her grandmother's memories, she could see the true shape of what they were attempting, not just the cleansing of corruption, but the healing of wounds that had festered in the world's spirit for generations. Godfred cried out as the last of the dark threads were torn from his essence, his body convulsing with the violence of separation. For a terrifying moment, Astrid thought they had been too late, that the corruption had become so entwined with his life force that removing it would kill him. But then his breathing steadied, and when he opened his eyes, they were clear grey. Once more, free of the silver fire that had marked his descent into darkness, he was himself again, damaged, aged beyond his years, but fundamentally human in a way he had not been for decades. "Sister," he whispered, his voice carrying the weight of 3 generations' worth of guilt and sorrow. "What have I done?" "What you thought you had to," she replied, her own voice growing faint as the transformation neared completion. "What anyone might have done, faced with the same choices and the same pain." The silver chalice was nearly full now, its contents roiling with contained malevolence that strained against her will with every passing moment. She could feel her grandmother's presence beginning to fade as the old woman's essence was consumed by the effort of containing such vast corruption. "Remember us kindly," the memory grandmother whispered, her voice growing distant as she prepared for the final sacrifice. "Remember that we chose love over fear, hope over despair." Around them, the valley had begun to stabilize as the last of the corrupted energy was drawn into the chalice. The cracks in reality sealed themselves, the poisonous air cleared, and even the shattered crystals began to glow with something approaching their original purity. But the effort was taking its toll on Astrid as well. She could feel her life force burning away like oil in a lamp, each second of the transformation, costing her months or years of the future she would never see. Her hair had turned completely white, and her hands bore the marks of premature aging that spoke of time accelerated beyond all natural bounds. Einar reached toward her, his face twisted with anguish as he watched her sacrifice herself for a world that had given her nothing but pain and loneliness. "Stop!" he pleaded. There has to be another way. There is no other way, she said, her voice carrying a terrible finality. This is what I was born for. This is why the bloodlines were preserved, not to rule, but to serve when the time of greatest need arrived. The silver chalice reached its limit, and Astrid felt the moment when choice became inevitability. The corruption was contained, but it could not remain in the material world without risk of eventual escape. It had to be taken somewhere else, somewhere beyond the reach of mortal ambition or accident. Goodbye, my love, she whispered to Einar, pouring all her feelings into those 3 simple words. Live well, love again, find the happiness that was denied to us. And then, before he could protest or argue or try to stop her, she spoke the final word of the transformation and felt reality fold around her like the pages of a closing book. The transformation tore through dimensions like lightning through storm clouds. Astrid felt herself being pulled across the boundaries between worlds. The silver chalice clutched against her chest as she carried 3 generations' worth of corruption away from the realm of the living. The journey lasted both an instant and an eternity, time having no meaning in the spaces between realities. When the tumbling finally stopped, she found herself in a place that existed outside of normal space, a grey realm where the sky was neither day nor night, and the ground beneath her feet felt solid but somehow insubstantial. The eternal amber that encased this pocket dimension preserved everything within it unchanged, creating a prison from which nothing could ever escape. The silver chalice had transformed during the journey, becoming a crystalline tree whose branches reached toward the colorless sky. Each leaf was a fragment of contained corruption, held in stasis by her will and the power of her grandmother's sacrifice. As long as the tree stood, as long as she maintained her vigil, the darkness would remain trapped here, unable to spread its poison to the world she had left behind. But the price of that protection was absolute isolation. She could see through the barriers that separated this realm from the material world, could watch the lives of those she had saved unfold across the years, but she could never touch or speak to them again. She was a ghost, haunting the edges of reality, present but powerless to affect the world she protected. In the valley she had left behind, Einar knelt where she had vanished, his hands pressed against the stone circle as if he could somehow pull her back through sheer force of will. The golden torque around his neck had shattered completely during the transformation, its power spent in trying to maintain a connection that cosmic forces had severed. "She's gone," Godfred said, his voice hollow with grief and guilt. "My sister, the last hope of our bloodlines, is gone because of choices I made decades ago." But old Eric shook his head, his weathered face turned toward the sky, where strange lights had begun to dance among the clouds. "Not gone. Changed. Look there. See how the aurora bends toward this valley? That's her power, working even now to heal what was broken. Indeed, the very air seemed cleaner, charged with an energy that made every breath feel like a blessing. The corrupted crystals throughout the valley were glowing with pure light once more, and in the distance they could hear the sound of fresh springs bubbling up from the earth. Young Ragnar, still wounded but alive, pointed toward the ruined hall where new growth had already begun to sprout from the ancient stones. "The curse is broken. The land remembers what it was meant to be." But for Einar, no amount of healing could fill the emptiness where love had briefly flowered. He had found his destined mate only to lose her to forces beyond his understanding, and the knowledge that her sacrifice had saved countless lives did little to ease the ache in his heart. In her crystalline prison, Astrid watched his grief with her own heart breaking. She had known the cost when she made her choice, but knowing and experiencing were vastly different things. To see him suffer because of her decision was almost worse than her own exile. Yet as the days passed, days that felt like years in her timeless realm, she began to understand that her sacrifice had meaning beyond the immediate crisis. Through the amber walls of her prison, she could sense other pockets of corruption stirring in distant lands, drawn by the removal of the great darkness she now contained. When those secondary infections began to spread, her power reached out to contain them as well, adding new branches to the crystalline tree. She was not just guarding against the return of the old corruption. She was actively healing the wounds it had left in the world's spiritual fabric. Each act of cleansing added to her strength, and slowly, very slowly, she began to understand that this exile might not be as permanent as she had feared. The eternal amber that imprisoned her was not just a barrier, it was a chrysalis, a place of transformation where something new could grow from the ashes of what had been destroyed. If she could maintain her vigil long enough, if she could cleanse enough of the world's spiritual poison, perhaps the day would come when her prison would become her release. But that day lay far in the future, beyond her ability to measure or predict. For now, she had only the knowledge that her sacrifice mattered, that every moment of her exile was a moment of safety for the world she loved. And in the endless twilight of her crystalline realm, surrounded by the gentle glow of contained corruption, transformed into healing light, she found a kind of peace that she had never known in life. She was alone, but she was not forgotten. And sometimes, when the barriers between worlds grew thin, she could swear she heard Einar's voice calling her name on the wind. 20 years passed in the world beyond the crystal prison, and the northern kingdoms slowly healed from wounds that had festered for generations. The ancient bloodlines, no longer hunted to extinction, began to emerge from hiding. Children were born with the gift of true sight, and the old songs were sung once more in halls that had known only silence for decades. The memory stone that Einar carried now bore the weight of all those years, a simple piece of amber that had appeared at his feet the morning after Astrid's sacrifice. Within its golden depths, he could sometimes glimpse her face, serene and ageless, watching over the world, with eyes that held both sorrow and infinite compassion. He had never remarried. Though many worthy women had sought his hand, how could he explain that his heart belonged to someone who existed beyond the reach of mortal love, that he carried within him the memory of a connection so profound it made all other relationships seem like pale shadows? Instead, he had become something he never expected, a builder rather than a destroyer. The kingdom he had forged from the ashes of Godfred's empire was founded on principles that would have seemed impossibly idealistic to his younger self. Justice tempered by mercy, strength guided by wisdom, power exercised in service rather than dominance. Godfred had become his most trusted advisor, the former tyrant transformed by guilt and gratitude into a man dedicated to undoing the harm he had caused. Together, they had established schools where the ancient arts could be studied safely, hospitals where healers trained in both medicine and magic could tend to those in need, and courts where justice was dispensed without regard to bloodline or birth. "She would be proud," Godfred said one evening as they stood on the walls of their new capital, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "Our sister. She would see what we've built and know that her sacrifice bore fruit." Einar touched the memory stone at his throat, feeling its familiar warmth against his skin. "Sometimes I wonder if she can see us. If somehow, across all the barriers that separate us, she knows that the world she saved is becoming worthy of that salvation." In her crystalline realm, Astrid did indeed watch, and her heart swelled with pride at what her loved ones had accomplished. The corruption she guarded had diminished greatly over the years, its virulent energy transformed into healing light that fed the growing network of cleansed crystals throughout the northern kingdoms. The eternal amber that had once been her prison was cracking now, hairline fractures spreading across its surface as the balance of power shifted. For the first time since her exile began, she dared to hope that freedom might be possible, not just for her, but for all the innocent souls that had been consumed by the corruption and were now held safe within her crystalline tree. The breakthrough came on the winter solstice of the 20th year, when the barriers between worlds grew thin and the accumulated power of 2 decades of healing reached critical mass. The crystalline tree began to sing, a sound like bells made of starlight, audible across dimensions. In the mortal world, every person touched by the ancient bloodlines felt the resonance in their bones. They turned their faces toward the sky, where aurora lights danced in patterns that spelled out words of hope in the old tongue. The message was simple but profound. The exile ends. The guardian returns. Einar dropped to his knees in his private chamber, the memory stone blazing so brightly in his hands that he had to shield his eyes. Through its amber depths, he could see the crystalline realm cracking open like an egg, releasing light that had been building for 20 years of patient sacrifice. And there, stepping through fissures in reality itself, came Astrid, not as she had been when she left, aged by magical transformation, but as she was meant to be. The years of her exile had transformed her into something between mortal and immortal, human, yet touched by forces beyond human understanding. She appeared first as light, then as shadow, and finally as flesh and blood and beating heart. When Einar took her in his arms, she was solid and real and wonderfully, impossibly present. "You waited," she whispered against his chest, her voice carrying wonder at the faithfulness that had endured decades of separation. "I promised you forever," he replied, his voice rough with emotions too large for words. "I meant it." Around them, the world continued its gentle transformation. The corruption was not destroyed. It could never be destroyed, but it had been changed into something beneficial, a dark thread woven into a tapestry of light that made the whole pattern stronger and more beautiful. The kingdoms that rose in the years that followed bore little resemblance to the crude realms of conquest that had preceded them. These were nations built on the understanding that power existed to serve rather than to dominate, that strength was measured by what one protected rather than what one conquered. And at the heart of it all stood 2 people who had found each other across impossible odds, who had learned that love was not just a feeling but a choice, the choice to sacrifice everything for another's well-being, and to trust that such sacrifice would not be wasted. Some people are forgotten by the world, cast aside like broken things nobody wants to fix. But sometimes the most unlikely person becomes the key to everything, not through power or ambition, but through the simple willingness to put others before themselves. In the end, that willingness transformed more than just kingdoms or bloodlines, or ancient magic. It transformed the very meaning of what it meant to be human, reminding a world that had forgotten its better nature, that redemption was always possible for those brave enough to choose love over fear.